Fighting Through Podcast, episode 108, Chapter 1, The Beginning, The Territorial Army, 1939. It was early April 1939, and a long, cold winter lay behind us. It would soon be Easter, spring was in the air, and the notion, put on your Easter bonnet with all the frills upon it, helped to put everybody in a good mood, even though times were not too easy in 1939. There was to be peace in our time, or so Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, told us on his return from his meeting with Hitler. The good feeling at the start of spring belied the foreboding thoughts that were uppermost in our minds in the pursuit of everyday life. Apart from the politicians, of course, who seemed to have buried their heads in the sand like the ostrich, hoping that the problems would go away. That's how it looked to me, anyway. Only Winston Churchill was agitating with his usual charismatic vigour and was warning of the danger that lay ahead for our country. I was young and carefree, and could probably have been forgiven for asking myself what the future held for me. I needed to do something positive. There was little doubt that the country would be at war with Germany in the not-too-distant future, and I knew that I was of an age when I'd be called up to serve my country. I convinced myself that I should do what I wanted to do before being told what I had to do. The Territorial Army appealed to me, so on the 24th day of April 1939 I made my way to Middlesbrough and enlisted in the 6th Battalion of the Green Howards. I had, for better or worse, taken a step which would influence my life for many years, and at the time I could not possibly have envisaged what traumatic events lay ahead of me. I duly attended the weekly sessions at the drill hall in Lytton Street, Middlesbrough, and these culminated in my going to the annual training camp at Marton, near Morecambe. We were, of course, under canvas, in bell tents, which were most uncomfortable, a taste of things to come. The weather was atrocious, and the ground was a quagmire. We had to walk everywhere on duckboards. Route marches were the order of the day, and these were usually of 20 miles. The only weapon we had was a Lee-Enfield rifle, which was a bolt-action, magazine-fed, repeating rifle. But we did not even attend a firing range in order to acquaint us with the weapon. I remember that the song of the day was South of the Border, and we gave it some stick on our marches. It's almost unbelievable to me that the story I'm now going to tell started on a lovely English summer's day in August 1939, over 50 years ago, and would not end until almost 6.5 years later. My 20s would have gone, but on the credit side, I would be a much-travelled and wiser individual in every way. At that time, I was on a camping holiday with 3 pals. Our site was on lovely farmland at Crediton in Devon. I had never travelled so far south before, and it had been my intention to go as far as Land's End. My car was a Morris 10, registration VN9248, and it had been bought new for £187 and 10 shillings, a lot of money then. It was a lovely, warm, sunny day in an unspoilt meadow where wild flowers were growing in abundance and the larks hovered in the sky. I hadn't a care in the world. I'd been for a dip in the river which ran at the bottom of the field, and on my way back called at the farm for fresh milk and eggs which we had for breakfast. Life was wonderful. I stretched out on the grass under a scorching sun. my head resting on my arms, thinking and listening to the wireless. Around 10:30 a.m, the programme was interrupted for a news flash, and at that moment my little world fell apart. The newsreader announced that a national emergency had been declared and that all members of the Territorial Army were to report to their headquarters without delay, to be ready for service in 2 days' time. I was flabbergasted. It was 22nd of August, 1939, and a day I would never forget. Our camping holiday came to an abrupt end, and we all set to, pulling the tent down and packing the car. We were soon on our way back home up north, 320 miles away. Those were the days when 60 miles an hour was speeding. Drivers weren't as aggressive as they are today. They loved their cars, and it was indeed a joy to drive. Nobody was in a hurry to get from A to B. One of the boys was named Don Savage, but more of him later in my story, which has a happy beginning and a happy ending, but a great number of events in between are tinged with sadness and sorrow. What follows is the story of my 20s. There was no need to dream what I'd do with my life. Destiny had all that worked out for me. Chapter 2. Call Up. I reported to my unit, the 6th Green Howards, B Company, on 24th of August 1939, the day before my 22nd birthday, and was not very impressed with the situation which greeted me. There were khaki-clad figures everywhere, doing nothing but rushing about, trying to look important, but with no serious thought in mind, not knowing what a situation the country had got itself into. Young men of the Territorial Army kept arriving from all parts of the North Riding of Yorkshire. This was the catchment area from which the Green Howards Regiment was formed. The 6th Battalion Green Howards was part of an English county regiment, the 19th Foot of Alexandra, the Princess of Wales' own Yorkshire regiment, whose depot was at Richmond, Yorkshire. The regiment was first raised in 1688 by a Colonel Luttrell, and had a great number of battle honours which would be upheld and added to in the Second World War. Being one of the few regiments left to retain its name, it formed a vital part of Her Majesty's forces, serving anywhere trouble was found. It comprised good and true men, and at the risk of me being pompous, splendid soldiers, as our record shows. We went to the company stores and withdrew our rifles and bayonets, plus whatever other kit was available. But it was very obvious there was a great shortage of everything, though this was quite understandable, and time would remedy that. It all went to prove how totally unprepared the country was for the emergency. One would have thought that the Munich crisis of 1938, which involved Germany dismembering Czechoslovakia while the rest of Europe did nothing about it, would have set some alarm bells ringing in government circles. They should at least have suspected that things had come to a head and made an attempt at ensuring the forces were tuned up to a higher state of readiness than they were. We were each issued with 2 blankets which had to be signed for, as had every item of equipment we were issued with. At least, being a member of the Territorial Army gave us the privilege of having a genuine rifle rather than a wooden one, though up to that time we'd not been given any practice with live ammunition, but the time would come. I managed to secure a space away from the door because of all the comings and goings. There were about 50 of us in the drill hall, and it was bedlam, with everyone trying to talk at the same time, discussing where they were when they were called up. A few of us who were pals managed to be near each other. The storeman was Ray Dale. He was such a character, and I got on well with him. He was very serious and most conscientious as a storeman, and he used to think, or at least gave the impression, that we were all claiming something we were not entitled to, but he was really a good-hearted lad. He came from Bishop Auckland in County Durham. 2x4 was like gold dust to him. This was a piece of thin flannel material that we used to clean the bore of our rifle with. My first pal was a boy named Ivor Castor, who lived at Grangetown. He was a good, down-to-earth north-east lad who'd worked at the Dorman Long Steelworks nearby and was 19 years of age and a very strong lad. As the war progressed, he became bored with the routine of life in the infantry, so volunteered for the paratroops, and subsequently lost an arm when he was in action at Arnhem during the bungled Market Garden operation. I met him when I was on leave, and his extrovert character had changed to introvert. His experiences had shattered his ego. Another boy was Les Blowers, a likeable lad with a very quiet nature, but I eventually lost touch with him. Pals in the army were like shadows. They came and went with great frequency. A few reservists had to be recalled and were distributed around different platoons. Naturally, they pretended they knew all there was to know about everything, but actually didn't know a great deal at all. They were supposed to keep us youngsters on the straight and narrow and bolster our morale. In fact, we got the impression that they were only a pack of scroungers. We were young, healthy and high-spirited lads, and we mucked in really well right from the start, whereas the ex-regulars were about 30 years of age and mostly married. They were not very reliable and gradually crawled their way into jobs where they felt sure they would not take part in any battles. In the course of time, most of these older men were not the soldiers who set an example when confronted by the enemy. There were exceptions, of course, genuine characters who really gave us their support. For some months after call-up, I was stationed at Middlesbrough, Redcar, Stockton and Hartlepool, mainly doing guard duties. My first Sergeant Major was Jerry O'Grady, who obviously hailed from Ireland. He was about 40 years of age and liked the sound of his own voice. He had a red face and bull neck and liked his drink. He was a bit of a bully and had his favourites, who also did their share of drinking. The regimental sergeant major was called Hughes, and he was a very strict disciplinarian, but fair, which was a good thing. I recall he was only about 5 feet 2 inches in height and was very broad-shouldered. He looked very formidable to us young lads. I'm sure he was almost as wide as he was tall. That's how I imagined him anyway. He was, of course, a regular soldier and conveyed the impression that the whole conduct of the war depended on him. But that misapprehension had developed in him through his long association with discipline in the army. I can see him now and can hear his deep voice. He'd bellow on the parade ground, which was at that time a large grass field. He'd shout, "Parade! Parade Jow!" which translated means, "Parade, attention!" Although he gave the impression that he was very bad-tempered, I always felt that it was an act of discipline, and this had to be enforced, because if we understood the meaning of the word, we would make good soldiers. This tyrant was doing a thorough job and expected us to respond. It was the foundation of the British Army, which was second to none in the world. RSM Hughes gave us a very good grounding on how to behave ourselves and conduct ourselves with honour. Our commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Steele, an excellent, fair-minded soldier. Our B Company commander was Captain Chapman. About November 1939, we received 2 new second lieutenants. One was Hughes and the other was Claude Hull, who proved over the years to be a very brave and popular officer who eventually attained the rank of major. He was very conscientious from the start. I can see him now. He was only of small stature, and he would step it out, cane under his left arm, and when he returned a salute, there was nothing half-hearted about it. Most officers were of first-class material, and considering they were not regular soldiers, performed wonders with great enthusiasm, despite such meagre resources as were available at the time, therefore earning a well-deserved respect from their platoons, which responded with extra effort when called upon. They carried out their duties with utmost vigilance, an important part of which was learning how to understand and handle men of such different personalities. Young officers had to have the capacity to absorb tremendous quantities of knowledge. A platoon officer was responsible for the lives and welfare of 30 young men, and this was no small undertaking. Just as in civilian life, men in uniform had their own peculiar characteristics, some quiet and reserved, others boisterous and aggressive. They resented the enforced discipline. Yet when the time came for us to go into action, they were first-class soldiers. Of course, there was always the man who showed signs of revolt. Consequently, he had to serve a period of punishment, which usually consisted of being put on a 252, an army charge sheet, followed by 7 days yankers. This meant that he was at the beck and call of the duty non-commanding officer, the NCO, doing things like peeling sacks of spuds, which was an unenviable task, and of course he was also confined to barracks or camp, depending on our location. It was my experience many times as the years passed that these regular offenders made excellent soldiers, the most dependable in the face of adversity, and always gave their best under active service conditions. They were afraid of nothing. We did not have any weapons larger than a rifle, so weapon training was out of the question. Nobody gave us any lectures about battle tactics in a given situation, and no field training of any description was undertaken, partly because no up-to-date training manuals had been made available to us. Our officers must have felt very frustrated. It seemed to me that the country found itself in a disastrous situation. When I was called up, my pay was 2 shillings, 10 pence a day, and half of this was made into an allowance for my mother. This 50-50 arrangement continued throughout the war as my pay increased. Pay in the army was a constant source of complaint amongst the boys, and we were almost always broke. Comparing our rewards with the American forces, we were paupers, and as we fought the same war, it was most unfair. As the saying goes, we just had to grin and bear it. Pay parade was an event not to be missed, and it would be up on the company notice board what time pay would be given out. An officer would be at a table with an army blanket spread out on it, and a clerk would be sitting at one end. A queue would form about 6 yards away, and a soldier would step out smartly and salute, say his number and name, and hand his paybook to the clerk, who would confirm this. He would then hold his hand out smartly to the officer, say, "Thank you, sir," salute, about turn, and step it out. On active service, this went by the board. We received pay if and when it was convenient. Before the outbreak of war, I ran a grocer's shop in conjunction with my mother, but our shop had now been closed down and our cars sold. Strange how I did not feel the loss of them. On the other hand, life in the army was a new adventure, and if one adapted to it, that was fine. I had before me a whole new way of life, and I never found any difficulty in coming to terms with it, even though there were complaints when we didn't know what was going on. We seemed to be going nowhere fast during those early months of the war. Perhaps it was a good thing at the time that I did not realise what a most exciting, dangerous, and traumatic but rewarding experience I had embarked upon. At times, everybody became a little bored or browned off, as we always said in the army. But one thing that kept most of us going was the comradeship which existed amongst lads who'd been complete strangers such a short while ago. This esprit de corps would become embedded in our attitudes as time went by and became invaluable when we went into battle, when on so many occasions our lives could depend upon our pals. Life in the army really was not so bad, once we had had our little moan amongst ourselves. In no way at the present time was the Territorial Army on a par with the regular army. We were not equipped mentally or physically to take offensive action against a determined and well-armed enemy. It was going to take some time for us to become what was expected of the British soldier, and it would not happen overnight, though it most certainly would come about. Also, of course, the factories would require time to come on stream to produce the weapons of war we were all waiting for, and the labour force too needed time to adjust to the mainly repetitive work many of them would have to do. I had now been in uniform for 6 months. The time seemed to have passed quickly, and although our work up to now had been fairly humdrum and repetitive, there was no doubt about it. We were fitter than we were 6 months ago, and this had not been achieved without undue effort. 6 months after the outbreak of war, we had still not received any additional weapons, and a great deal of our time seemed to be wasted. It is almost unbelievable that for 8 months from call-up, all we did were drill parades, guard duties on the coast, kit inspection, and the usual non-productive activities. We'd not even talked about any kind of tactics, or even undertaken a route march to toughen us up. Not a finger was lifted to train us for war. It seemed that everybody thought that if our army kept quiet, Hitler would go away. So during April 1940, we went to France, not to fight the Germans, but to construct an airstrip. End of chapter 2.